Today we're going to take a deep dive into text animators in After Effects. Most people are probably familiar with the pre-built text animations that come bundled in After Effects that you find in the Effects and Presets panel. Jake in Motion provides an excellent overview on a lot of these, and I'll provide a link to that video down in the description. Did you know that it's just as easy to create your own text animation presets that you can customize to your heart's content? We're going to take a look at creating 10 different text animators using a bunch of different properties. And at the end of the video, I'll show you how to save them as your very own animation presets. I'll also be making the presets that we create today available on my Gumroad page, linked down below as well. We're going to start off by creating a simple reveal animation. And we're going to use the techniques that we learn here and build upon them as we build out the rest of our text animators. So we're going to turn off this text layer for now, and we're going to add in our own text. This is a simple reveal animation, period. And a quick keyboard shortcut to center up your text and the center of the anchor point is Command or Control Home will center your text, and Command Option or Control Alt Home on your keyboard will center your anchor point. It's not really important to center your text for this specific type of animation. I just find it easier to work with when it's right in the middle. So to add our text animator, you can either click on this arrow here and twirl down our text properties, and we have access to it there. Or we can go up to Window, and if you're in After Effects 2023, you can go to your Properties panel, which is a new addition. And we have access to add our text animator over here as well. For the purposes of this video, and since I know not everybody's updated to 2023 yet, I'm going to stick to the old way of doing it by adding it right down in our timeline. So for this simple reveal animation, we're going to be animating two properties, the position and the opacity of our text layer. So we're going to click on Animate, and we're going to click Position. And what I like to do is use our first animator as our initial state of our text animator. That way, as we build onto it, we're building off of a base layer instead of having to manage a bunch of different keyframes on a bunch of different text animators. So if we hit enter on our keyboard, we can rename this, and we're going to call it Initial State. And we're also going to add an opacity property to this as well by clicking Add and going to Opacity. Our initial state is going to be down on the y-axis. So we're going to drag this down a little bit. Let's make this 120 pixels. And our initial state is also going to be at 0% opacity. And now our text animator disappears. So we can take our initial state, and we're going to hit Command or Control D on our keyboard, and we're going to duplicate it. And we're going to call this Final State. And here, instead of having a value of 120, we're going to reverse this and have it be -120. And that brings it right back up to our center area here. And this is another reason that I wanted to have our text centered, because it gives you an easy visual as to where your text is as you add your animation properties. And we're also going to change our opacity to 100%. Okay, and now we have an initial state and a final state, but it's not animated yet. So we're going to go to the beginning of our timeline by hitting Home on our keyboard. We're going to twirl down our range selector. And we're also going to twirl down our advanced properties so we have everything available to work with. Now there's a couple different ways that you can add animation. You can use it with the start and end points by animating those, and that animates front to back and back to front respectively. Or you can animate the offset, which I find the easiest way to work with text animators. So we're going to set our offset back to 0. And you probably saw as I was playing with these sliders that we're animating right now by each character. And we want this to animate by word. So we're going to set this back to 0, and we're going to go down to our advanced properties and change this based on from characters to words. Now we can go back up to our offset, and as we drag this back, we can see that it's animating word by word. So we're going to bring this all the way to -100, and we're going to add our first keyframe at the beginning of our timeline. And we're going to move forward to about 1 second. A quick way to move forward and back in your timeline is pressing Shift and page down or Shift and page up to move forward and back. So we're going to move forward to 1 second, and we're going to change our offset to 0. Now when we play this back, we have our animation. But it's not a very smooth animation right now. So we're going to tweak some of our advanced properties so we can have it be much smoother. So we're going to go to 1 second in our timeline so we can see everything that we're working with. And we're going to change our shape from square to either ramp up or ramp down. I usually default to ramp down, and now when we play this back, we realize that it doesn't complete the animation all the way. It stops about halfway through. So we're going to go to our second keyframe that we have on our offset, and we're just going to crank this all the way up to 100%. And that completes our animation. Now when we play it, it's a little bit smoother, but we can smooth it out even more by changing our ease high to 100%. And now when we play this back, we have a nice smooth reveal animation. This is really cool if you want to create a bunch of Mogrts and use these type of text animations in Premiere to add a bit more variety to the text animations that you can do within Premiere. And if we really wanted, we could just select our keyframes here and press F9 on our keyboard and easy ease those as well, just for a little bit more smoothness. Next, we're going to move on to our fly-in animation. Now, if we move forward in our timeline, we play this. This one is similar to our reveal animation, but it starts from the very bottom of our screen, and we added a little bit of a bounce in there as well. And as you can see from revealing all of my keyframes, we really only add 6 keyframes, but we get a whole bunch of motion on each of the characters in this text layer. So we're going to move forward to the end of our timeline. We'll turn off this text layer, and we're going to add our new text again. And again, to quickly center up our text and our anchor point, we're going to press Command Home and Command Option Home. And we're just going to close up the properties on our base layer here, and we'll twirl down our text properties here. So again, we're going to animate our position property, and we're going to set an initial state of our position. And our initial state in this case is going to be all the way off of the screen. So we drag it until we can just barely see it at the bottom of our screen here. And we're going to duplicate that. And we're going to call this state 1. And we're going to change this again to the negative value. And that brings it back up to the center, but we want to have a little bit of an overshoot here. So we're going to bring it up just a little bit more. And now we can add our keyframes. So we're going to go to the beginning of our timeline here, twirl down our range selector. We're going to add a keyframe to our offset, set this to -100. We're going to move forward to 1 second, and we're going to set this to +100. And that makes it go away. That's because we haven't changed our shape from square to ramp down, and we haven't tweaked our easing yet. All right, and I think we're going to keep this animating based on characters. So we can close up state 1, and we're just going to press Command or Control D on our keyboard, and now we have state 2. And for this, we're going to just zero this out so it brings it back down to the bottom. And now when we select our text layer, we see that our anchor point's no longer in the middle because it's still staying in state 1. So we're going to take our position, and we're just going to animate this down until our anchor point is about back in the center of our text. Now when we play this, it goes straight from the initial state to state 2, but that's because we need to offset our keyframes. So we can either drag our lasso around these 2 keyframes here down in our timeline, or over on the left, we can click to select our offset, and we can just drag these forward about 10 frames or so. And we'll just extend our work area and see what we have to work with. Now our animation goes from the initial state up to state 1 and snaps back down into state 2. And we have a nice bouncy animation on it. And that adds a nice bit of overshoot. We can also take our state 2 and we can duplicate that. And in our original state 2, we can drag this down a little bit further. And if we twirl down state 3 and we go to the end of our keyframes, we can just drag this all the way back up until our anchor point is centered again. Press U on our keyboard so we can see all of the keyframes that we have to work with. And we'll just offset our state 3 keyframes a little bit more. Now when we play this back, we'll have a little bit of an overshoot and a nice little bounce that happens towards the end. And again, we can select all of our keyframes and press F9 on the keyboard to add a little bit more easing to them. And here we have our text that's having a bit of a rotation and scale on each of the characters here. And if I open up all of my properties here, we can see that we set initial scale and initial rotation for both of these. I'm going to try to condense that into what we have here. So we're going to turn off our rotation and scale layer. We're going to go back up to our text tool, and we're just going to, again, add our own text here. And I think we're going to change the font on this to be a little bit lighter, so it's more similar to what we had to work with at the beginning. So we'll close up our base layer here, and we're going to twirl down our text properties again. We're going to animate the scale, and we're going to go into Animator 1, and we're going to add a rotation. And again, this is going to be our initial state. And I think I want this to do a 180-degree rotation. So we're going to start this at 180. And we're going to scale this down a lot. And we'll scale that down to like 2%. So you can barely even see them. Now we're going to take our initial state and we're going to duplicate that. Call it state 01. And we're going to bring this back to 0. And we're actually going to add a little bit of an overshoot to this as well. So we'll bring it back maybe negative 20 degrees. And we're going to bring up our scale. Now, you can see that you really have to crank up the scale to get it back to where it needs to be the right size. And I think that's somewhere around 5,000%. And we change our scale to negative 180. Sorry, I forgot about that. And we'll just add maybe a negative 20. So it ends up being negative 200. And we're gonna bring our scale actually up a little bit more, maybe 5,500. And we're gonna go into our range selector, offset, negative 100. Go forward 20 frames, and we're gonna change this to positive 100. We'll twirl down our advanced, and we'll change this from square to ramp down, and we'll crank up our easing. Okay, now we have our first animation, and we already built in the overshoot. So now when we duplicate our state 01 to state 02, you can see that it really blows up our scale. So we're just going to take our scale and change it back to 100%. And that brings it back to its original size. And we're just going to take our rotation and move it all the way to positive 20, but it looks like that's a little bit too far. So we'll move it to maybe positive 19. And we can take our range selector and our offset keyframes, and we're just going to shift those forward maybe 8 frames. And now we have our rotation and scale animation with a little bit of overshoot to it. And the awesome thing about text animators is even though we built this in here, we can change the text to be whatever we want it to be, and our animation properties stay the exact same. So in the past, I used to use tools like decompose text to break apart text into different characters and animate those characters individually. I've since moved to doing a lot of this with text animators, because while it doesn't give you as much flexibility as having your own individual layer for each character, it does give you plenty of flexibility when you're trying to reuse text throughout your projects. You no longer have to go in and break apart the text and animate them all individually. You can build these presets and drag and drop them, and it really speeds up your workflow. Our next text animation that we're going to look at is creating this glitchy text animation here. So just as before, we're going to go up to our text tool. We're going to turn off our base layers here, and we're just going to start typing out some text. We're going to center that up in the center of our composition, and we're going to twirl down our text animators here. So for this animation, we're going to be animating the opacity, the scale, and the position. And we're going to be using a different type of selector called a wiggle selector. So first we're going to go to Animate, and we'll adjust our scale first. And I think I want our scale to be pretty big, about that size there. And we're going to add selector wiggly. Left on its own, this wiggly selector will automatically animate your text to have like a nice fun bouncing animation. And that's kind of interesting on its own, but we're going to turn this into something more tech looking. So we're going to twirl down our wiggly selector options here, and we're going to change our wiggles per second to 0. And we're also going to go to the beginning of our text layer here, and we're going to animate our random seed. So we're going to click the stopwatch to add a keyframe. We're going to right click the keyframe and go toggle hold animation. And that way it'll give us this nice glitchy popping animation in between each of the different sizes. So we're going to move forward maybe 3 keyframes. We're going to animate our random seed. We're going to drag our random seed to animate it. Go forward a couple more keyframes. Animate our random seed. And we're gonna do that like 7 or 8 times. Now we get this nice hopping animation between each of the letters. But right now the letters are scaling ununiformly, so we're just gonna click this lock dimensions and turn it on. That way our letters scale nice and uniformly. And now we're going to twirl down our range selector, and again we're going to animate our offset. This time we're going to go from 0 to 100, and that takes our text from glitching and then animates it to go in line. And unlike the other text animators, we're not going to twirl down our advanced here and change anything here, because the square shape gives it a nice glitchy movement on its own. And we're just going to rename this one scale so we know what we're working with. Now we can duplicate our scale text animation, and this one we're going to call position. And we're going to twirl this down, and next to our position we're going to add, and we're just going to add a position property, and we can delete our scale position from that. Now our position property, we can animate the Y, and we can animate the X. So now we have text glitching kind of all over the center of the screen here. That looks pretty nice. Maybe a little less on the Y and a little less on the X, so that way it stays more centered. That looks nice and glitchy. And we can just duplicate our position again, and this one we're going to call opacity. And again, we're going to go to add, property, and opacity. And we're going to delete our position from that one, and our opacity we're just going to drop to 0. And we're also going to drop our correlation down to 0. And we're going to leave our max amount at 100 and change our min amount to 0. Now we get this nice fading in glitch animation, and to take it to the next level like I did in the base layer, we can duplicate this and move it forward maybe 3 frames. And over in our properties panel, we can turn off the fill and turn on the stroke and give it a stroke of maybe 1. And I think we want to have the stroked letters start first, so we're going to alternate the direction of these. And now we have this nice cyber looking glitch animation for this. Next up is a simple tracking animation where we're just going to animate the tracking or the spacing between each of the letters. So for this, again, we're going to add some text, center it up. We'll turn our fill back on because we don't really need the stroke anymore. We're going to twirl down our text animator, and we're going to go to animate tracking. In tracking, you can do one of 2 ways. You can track in or track out. I kind of like the look of text as it tracks outwards and kind of fades off the screen. So we're going to start at 0. We're going to move forward maybe 2 seconds, and we're going to change our tracking to maybe 30. That looks pretty nice. Now when we play this, we have a nice tracking animation, but I want to have the text fade out before the track completes. So we're just going to go to our animator, going to add an opacity, add a keyframe at 100, move that back, and turn our opacity to 0. Now we have this nice elegant text tracking animation. And the cool thing about this is regardless of what you type in here, you'll maintain this text tracking animation. So this is really cool to use if you're building like a title sequence and you need to add a bunch of different names or titles in there. Next up is a simple slide and fade animation, and this one is animating the position and opacity. So we can turn off our base layer once again, add our text, go to the start of our timeline, twirl this down, animate. We're going to animate our position, and in this animator, which we're going to call initial, we're also going to add our opacity, so you can animate multiple properties in a single text animator. So this is going to be our initial state, so our opacity is going to be 0, and we're going to move this on the x-axis of our position. And we can duplicate this text animator and call it final state. And here again, much like our first animation, we're going to change this to -246 and 100. And now we can go to our range selector and take our offset to -100, move forward about 1 second, change this to +100, twirl down our advanced options and change this from square to ramp down, and change our easing. Now we have a nice slide in animation, and I think we want to also animate this out. So we'll change final state to mid state, and we'll duplicate that, and we're going to rename this final state. And we're going to take our opacity down to 0 again, and we're going to leave our position at -246. And we're just going to take our 2 keyframes on the offset and move these to the end of our timeline. Now when we play this, we'll have it slide and fade in and slide and fade out. It's kind of cool because you can add a different animation in Final. So if we wanted to have this animate out by words, we can have it animate in by characters and then slide out all at once, which just goes to show you how versatile text animators can be. This next text animation is probably my favorite of the bunch, where we have our characters rolling in 3D space, but they're also coming in from the top and bottom. And we're only going to do this with a couple different text animators. So as before, we'll turn off our base layer here, and we'll add our own text layer. Center it up within our composition here, and we'll hide that. We'll twirl this down, and we're going to start by animating our opacity. So we're going to go to opacity. This is going to be our initial, and that's going to go down to 0. We'll duplicate that, and that'll be our ending opacity, and we're going to set this to 100, and we'll twirl down our range selector, adjust our offset from -100, go forward 1 second, and that'll be +100. And just like before, twirl down advanced, and we'll change this from square to ramp down and crank up our ease high. Okay, now we have our characters animating in. Our next text animator we're going to add is going to be our rotate. So we're going to go down to rotation, and we're going to go to initial. And for this, we're going to also go up to animate and enable per character 3D. And that breaks our text layer into individual 3D characters. So these can all rotate in 3D space. So we're going to go down to our X rotation, and I'll go so you can see this, so you can see what's going on here. And we're going to rotate it backwards. Now, right now, it's rotating from these little X's down at the bottom, and that's the anchor point for each one of these. And we need to adjust those so we can actually get some 3D perspective in here. We're going to click our text layer, we're going to go to animate, and we're going to change the anchor point. And we'll drag this above our rotation. And we're just going to push our anchor point back in 3D space. And that's actually moving it in a positive direction. So we're going to move it forward maybe 125 pixels. We're going to call that anchor. So that's our anchor point, and we can actually move this up to the top and just get it out of the way there. Now when we change our X rotation, it's going to roll around where our anchor point is in 3D space. So you really get that 3D perspective as it's rolling around. So this is going to be our initial rotation. So we're going to change this to -90. So it rolls it back up to the top. And we'll duplicate this, and we'll call this rotation 1. And we're going to crank this down to maybe 116, 118. So we're going to have a little bit of overshoot here. And something we're going to add to this one, we're going to go to Add, Selector, Expression. And we're going to copy and paste this expression that I have on our initial text layer here. So to bring up expressions, you can just tap EE on your keyboard, and that brings up all of your expressions. And I'll paste this down in the description below, but what this expression is going to do is going to take every other letter, and it's going to take the inverse rotation of it. Our first letter will rotate from the top, our second letter will rotate from the bottom, and so on and so on. And we're going to twirl down our expression selector on our working layer here. And we already have an expression on the amount, so we're just going to paste that in there. And it kind of jumbles up all of our letters, so we also need to go back to our initial rotation and add our expression selector there as well. We'll paste that there. And now when we go to our end rotation, we can just rotate this back to maybe +85. And just like our others, we're going to go and animate the offset. So we'll set our end offset to 100. Go back to the beginning. This will be -100. Twirl down advanced, change our shape to ramp down, and our ease high to 100. Now when we play this forward, we can see our text rolls in from top and bottom, but we need to adjust where it kind of lands. So we're going to go down to our rotation 1. And we're just going to have this do a little bit of an overshoot there. and we're going to duplicate our rotation 1, and this is going to be where our text lands. So that looks about right. So -9 on that one. And now when we press U on our keyboard and open up our keyframes, we can offset the second rotation by a few frames. And now we have this nice, subtle bouncing effect as it rolls in. This next text effect also uses that expression that we used for our rolling text, and I just call this one zipper text because it's coming in from the top and bottom and fading in and kind of pulling together like a zipper. And this is going to be animating the position, the scale, and the opacity of our text layer. So we're going to add our text layer, we're going to center it up, going to turn off our base layer or our example layer here, and we're going to animate our scale. We're going to call that initial scale, and we're going to scale this up to maybe 125. And we're going to duplicate our initial scale, and we're going to call that one final scale. And this one we're going to crank back down until it looks about right. What you can do to make sure you get this perfect is go to our initial scale, and we'll set this to 100. And if we bring up our rulers with Command or Control R, we can just set a top and bottom guide. So when we're scaling our layers, we can make sure that we're getting it back to its original size. So if we change this back to 125 and we turn on our final scale, we can see that I made it a little bit too small. So we'll just crank this up a little bit, maybe 81% or 80%, and that looks about right. And we're going to twirl down our range selector and again animate our offset, changing that to ramp down. 100%, -100, and +100. All right, now we have our scale animated here. Now we can duplicate our initial scale. We'll drag that down below our final scale, and this is going to be our initial position. We're going to click Add, Property, Position. We're going to delete our initial scale or our scale value, and we're just going to crank this up to maybe 150. Okay, and that sets our initial position. We're going to add selector expression. We're going to paste our expression from our previous example. Again, I'll put this down in the description for your reference. And now we can duplicate our initial position and adjust this to -150, and that brings all of our text back, and we can animate our final position. And we can rename this one final position. And this, now we can add our animation keyframes at the beginning for -100 and 1 second for +100, and adjust our easing down here with a ramp down and 100%. Now we have our text that's scaling down and zipping together. Now we just need to add our beginning and end opacity. So we can click on text, go to Animate, Opacity, have our initial value. We can duplicate this, have that be our ending value. Set that to 100. And again, add our keyframes on the offset. So -100, +100, and adjust our easing so it matches with the rest of our keyframes. And just like that, we now have our zipper text. This next example again uses the per character 3D like our rolling text did, but this time we're going to be using the Cinema 4D render engine inside of After Effects, and we're going to be extruding our text, so it adds that extra level of 3D to it. So we're going to turn off our initial base layers, and we can turn off our pulse here, which I just used to animate the example, and we can add our text in. And we want to go up to our composition settings, and we want to go to 3D renderer and make sure that we have Cinema 4D selected so we can extrude our text. Have that selected, we're just going to click OK. And we're going to twirl down our properties here. We're going to enable 3D on this layer so we get our geometry options. We're going to change our bevel style to concave, and we're going to change our extrusion depth. Let's make this 100. And it just kind of looks like the text is getting bolder, but if we turn on our lights here, we can see that it adds that extra shadow depth into our 3D text here. If I turn on full resolution, you can see the edges and we can see the bevel that we added. So we're going to go to Text, Animate. We're going to animate our position and our rotation. And we also want to make sure that we enable per character 3D so we can animate in Z space. So our initial position, we actually want it to remain right where we put it. So we're going to have our initial position and we're going to duplicate that and we'll call this position 1. And here we're going to bring this forward negative, let's do negative 500. And we can add our animation keyframes now. Move this to the beginning. Negative 100. Positive 100. And change square to ramp down and crank up our ease high. And we're going to change our resolution down to like a third, just so I can work with this a little bit better. Now our text pops forward in 3D space, but we're going to also add a little bit of a rotation to it. So we're going to go to Animate, Rotation. Have our initial rotation, which is going to be 0. We're going to duplicate that. This is going to be our first rotation position. And I think for this one, we're going to animate it on X. So it's going to fly forward. But you can see that it's animating from like the front corner. So we want to go to our text, animate, anchor point. We'll just drag this up top. And we're just going to push our anchor point forward a little bit. We'll do 50, so it's in the center of our 100 pixel extrude. We're also going to bring this up on the y-axis too. Now it's rotating more or less from the middle of our text. So we're going to change our X rotation. We're going to do a full rotation in the X axis. And we're going to do our start and end keyframes. Change from square to ramp down, crank up our easing. Now when we play this, we have our text popping forward and rolling in. And now we're going to add our final position, which is going to be at positive 500, which is going to bring it right back to where it belongs. And we're going to add our final rotation by duplicating rotation 1. And this is going to be 2 on the x-axis. So right now it doesn't really do much, it just kind of rotates in place. But if we open up our keyframes and we push forward our, we'll just twirl this down so I can see which ones I'm actually animating. So we're going to offset our position 2 keyframes. I'm going to move this to right about there, about 18 frames. And same with our rotation 2 keyframes. We're going to push this forward about 18 frames. So now we have our text popping in and rolling back into place. If I play that, it gives kind of a neat effect. But our rotation is kind of going in the opposite direction, so I think we want to take our 2, and I think we're going to change that to -1 to undo the rotation of the text coming in. We can actually take these and move them out a little bit so we can have our text pop in, rest for a little bit, and then land back. Our next text animation, we're going to be making this flickering text. So it's kind of like a neon sign or a light bulb coming on. And I picked up this technique from another YouTuber called Smurtimbo Graphics. I'll leave a link to their channel down below. So we're going to turn off our base layer again. Going to add some text. Center up our text. And I'm going to make this large because I think this effect looks a little bit better when you have large text. And we're going to be animating our opacity. So our initial opacity, going to set that to 0. Now we have our initial opacity set to 0. We're going to duplicate this. And now we're going to add our animation. So we're going to change our opacity to 100%. We're going to twirl down our range selector and add our keyframes. So 0, we're going to move that to 1 second. We're going to move to the beginning of our timeline, set this to -100. Now we have our opacity animation, but we want this to be kind of a staggered animation. So for this, we're going to twirl down advanced and we're going to check randomizer and we're going to turn that on. And we're going to animate the random seed. So we're going to add a keyframe and move that to the beginning, jump to the end of our timeline, and we're going to crank this up to like 68. We'll do 70, so it's a nice even number. And now as this animates in, it's going to flicker. Now to get that glow effect, we're going to add the built-in After Effects glow. We're going to go to our effect controls. We'll set this to 20, and we're going to duplicate our glow. So you get a nice volumetric lighting look to it. We're going to change this to something like 200. Now when we play this, we have the light kind of flicker on, and you can see there's like a nice light cast over the entire scene. Something I did was duplicate the layer and shift my initial layer down a couple frames. And on our first layer, I'm going to turn off the fill and turn on the stroke. So that gives it kind of a nice staggered sort of neon sign type animation. Our last text animator here is bouncing text. And this is kind of cartoony and kind of fun. So I figured this would be a good one to include. So as before, we're going to turn off our initial layer, going to go to our text tool, going to add some text, center it up, and we'll actually turn the fill back on. And we're just going to scale this up quite a bit. And we're going to twirl down our options here and go to Animate, Scale. This is going to be our initial scale. And we're going to start this off at like 2%. We're going to duplicate our initial scale. Call it scale 01, and we're actually going to turn off our initial scale. We're actually going to turn off scale 1, set our initial scale to 100, and we're going to draw out guides so we know how far we're going to push our scale here. Okay, now we can set this back down to 2, turn on our scale 01, and we're just going to crank up our scale until it fits within those guides that we placed. We're at about 4,985. We're going to twirl down our options here, animate our offset to -100 and +100. And we're going to change this to ramp down. And we're going to change our ease high to like 40% and our ease low to 80%. And I think that gives kind of a nice bouncing feeling as we're moving through this. And since this is our first iteration of the bounce, we're going to actually crank up our bounce a little bit higher. We're going to duplicate our scale 01, have scale 2. We're going to crank this way down, a little bit smaller, so maybe like 65. And we're going to duplicate this one more time, and this is going to bring it back up to its normal size. Something like 119. Now if we press U on our keyboard to open up our keyframes, and we just offset these by like 10 frames a piece, bring that to 10, bring our next one to 20. We have this nice bouncing effect for our text as it animates in. And since this was our last text animator, now I'm going to show you how you can create your own text presets using the techniques that we built. So we're going to go to our rolling text because that's my favorite text animator so far. And we're just going to twirl down our arrow so we can see all of our text animators. So we're going to grab anchor all the way to rotation. We're going to go up to our effects and presets panel, and we're going to click our little option down here that says creates new animation preset. And we're going to save this as rolling text preset. And this saves into your user presets, which is stored in your Documents Adobe After Effects folder. So we're going to call this rolling text preset. We're just going to save that, and we'll create a new comp here. call it test text. And we're just going to create a new text layer here. And anytime you want to use this rolling text animation, we can go to our effects and presets panel, scroll down our animation presets, our user presets, and now we have a rolling text preset that we can just drag and drop onto our text here, and we instantly have our text animation. And what that does is it gives you your keyframes, and if you twirl down our options here, it also keeps all of the naming conventions that you've added here, so you remember exactly what each text animator and each layer that you added to your text layer does. So as you can see, there's a lot you can do with text animations within After Effects that can really add a lot of variety to your animations. As I mentioned, I'll leave a link to my Gumroad down below where you can download all of these text presets for free, and I'll also link to the couple other YouTube channels that I mentioned here as well. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below if there's any other types of text animations you'd like to see. Thanks for watching.